Welcome to another edition of Superhero Pantheon. My name is Jerome Cusana. On this episode, you are first going to hear our thoughts about X-Men 1. These are thoughts that we recorded about 1 year ago, and then we will get into brand new hashtag content with our review of X-2, X-Men United. We want to thank everybody for listening to last week's episode as we talked about Avengers Endgame. There is no Avengers Endgame discussion this time, so you don't have to worry about being spoiled if you have not yet seen that movie. There are some audio issues for the first X-Men review that I want to apologize for, but you can power your way through it, and things are much cleaner for X2. So without any further ado, let's get to our review of X-Men 1.
I'm Professor Charles Xavier.
I built this school where mutants could learn to focus their powers in a positive way, and also learn that mankind was not evil, just uninformed. You'll be safe here from Magneto, a very powerful mutant who believes that a war is brewing between mutants and the rest of humanity.
My co-host for this week and every week is Brian DeBrain, and fittingly, he can be found on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. Brian, are you ready to talk about the X-Men?
Yeah, and out of all the movies of the X-Men series, this is the one I've seen the most, only because it's been on TV so many times in the last 20 years growing up. I saw this movie twice in theaters when it first came out. Not my intention to see it twice. It was just I got invited a second time, and I was like, yeah, why not? Yeah, it definitely stands out a lot to me in my head for nostalgic reasons, but not because it's not a great movie. Let's get that right out of the way. It's not a great movie at all, but it's definitely had this impact in my brain because A, it was the first X-Men movie, and B, it's something that I wanted as a kid for ever since I watched the show. I wanted the X-Men movie, so I think that mixed in, it just really stands out for me a lot more than X-Men 2, 3, and all that stuff. Even though X-Men 2 is probably the best of the first three, and Logan's probably better than all of them combined. But this kind of just has its, it has its moments kind of thing, and it's always going to have that special place in my mind just because of the place and time of it.
Absolutely, and I think that one of the things that's most notable about the X-Men movie, I would argue that it's important within the history of the superhero genre, given all of the X-Men movies that have followed it, given the fact that Marvel kind of decided that they needed to put everything in-house at a certain point. So I think the legacy of this film is very important, but I'm not sure if everything else is necessarily going to hold up as well. Just to give you some background on this, really Marvel has had a not-so-great history of films up until the point of the year 2000. We mentioned a few weeks ago Captain America from 1990 and the infamous Fantastic Four film that was produced but never really seen. So really, this is the second time that we are seeing a Marvel property that was sold off because Marvel at one point was bankrupt. If you can believe that, Brian, Marvel at one point was very much in danger of just completely going away, and they were selling off some of their more famous properties, including X-Men, Spider-Man, the Hulk, Blade, Daredevil, and they were sold off. Then you would get some of these films, and Blade was kind of the first one. It was produced a couple years earlier. We will get into Blade at some point, but it was a moderate success, especially for something that was R-rated. So this was a huge opportunity. X-Men was one of Marvel's more popular properties. Part of that had to do with obviously the comics. Another part of that had to do with the very famous animated TV show that was on Fox Kids for a few years prior. And Brian, I know that you have probably very fuzzy feelings about that particular property as well.
Yeah, I can't wait for we mentioned it before, the Disney deal, but if they can just do that movie, the version of the show into a movie, I think that's what I want. Not just me, but all the fans, man. From the start, that's what we wanted. Those vivid, bright suits and the colors. God, I love the colors of the X-Men series. Their suits are so awesome. And that's what kind of that visual look you kind of need in a movie like this. But they just went completely opposite with that with this movie.
They're all wearing leather suits. Not effective at all. The whole color scheme of this movie is very muted, and that is definitely going to hurt its score, in my view.
Yeah, we'll get into that later, but I blame the Matrix for that once we get to that part of it.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but that is a very good point on your part. So this movie
Yeah.
was really only budgeted at about $75 million, and a couple of characters, including Nightcrawler and Beast, basically were cut from the original script, which, given how many characters there are in this movie, was probably not the worst thing. But it's funny because you basically have a lot of superhero godfathers of the past and the present and the future coming together for this movie, because on this film, Richard Donner and his wife both serve as producers of this film, and I believe I mentioned this a couple weeks ago. Richard Donner's wife continues to be a producer on all of the X-Men and Wolverine pictures up until this day in 2018. Kevin Feige served as an associate producer on this film. Joss Whedon wrote a draft, and of course you have Bryan Singer, who was the director of this, coming off of the success of The Usual Suspects. And Brian, unfortunately, we have to have the conversation about Bryan Singer. There have been a number of accusations surrounding him and some of his improprieties and some of his just absolutely disgusting behavior when it comes to issues of harassment and abuse. So that is something that, we unfortunately have to keep in mind as we are reviewing some of these superhero films, because Bryan Singer has a number of them in the X-Men franchise, and of course Superman Returns, and when we talk about some of the actors as well, this is something that we are going to have to address. But I'm not going to speak for you, Brian, but it goes without saying, Bryan Singer is a disgusting human being for the things that he has done, and if any positive things that we say about this film or X-Men 2 or any of the other X-Men movies, it should not be taken as a reflection of our views on him as a human being, because, what he has done, allegedly, is absolutely repulsive and is not something... I sincerely hope that he never directs a movie again, and he probably should not have been directing over the last few years as these accusations have become public.
Yeah, the thing is, I've heard about these going a while back. Like, I don't know, I've heard about them in college, and that was 2000. When did I hear about the stories? God, probably like when Origins came out, maybe 2009ish. He didn't even direct that; he was just the producer. But that's when I kind of heard about it, and then subsequent stories. I don't want to give details. It's alleged. You can go into it and research it yourself. But yeah, it's kind of a shocker that he's been able to direct still for the last 5-6 years since the stories broke out. But I think times are changing, obviously, and that is going to put a kibosh on that, hopefully. But like you mentioned, we're just going to, talk about his work and not the person itself. It's kind of like, watching Chris Benoit matches, going back to wrestling. So you kind of have to just separate that for what it is and, look at the artwork and kind of evaluate the artwork and not the person. So, yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on it. And I kind of hate to say this, but maybe the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was getting The Usual Suspects produced.
Yeah, it's extremely unfortunate. It's really hard to talk about, these movies, because, I really like the X-Men franchise for the most part. There's certainly been some duds, but for me, the X-Men is probably one of the properties that I relate most to because of the fact that there is the animated series that I watched, and for a while I was reading the comic books, and I just really have a lot of connection to this. And yeah, it's really tough to talk about Bryan Singer because I have absolutely no respect for who he is. But we are going to talk about the importance of this film and kind of address it, kind of aside from everything that Bryan Singer is and was associated. This is a very notable film because Hugh Jackman, this is his very first time playing Wolverine, as he then did about 9 more times, including all of the X-Men movies and 3 Wolverine films. Obviously, he had a small role in films like X-Men First Class and X-Men Apocalypse, but he has been such a huge part of this franchise, for better and for worse in some cases. But yes, we cannot talk about the X-Men franchise without talking about Hugh Jackman, and we're going to be saying a lot about Hugh Jackman and what he's done over the course of 17 years. But specifically, Brian, as we talk about him as one of the primary heroes of this film, what is your viewpoint of Hugh Jackman and his performance.
He's like the saving grace of these movies. Like, he is the star. He is the centerpiece to me. You needed a guy that can like bring the character to life, because Wolverine is a hard character to bring to life. You got to be jacked. You got to be aggressive. You got to have this darkness to you. Wolverine has this darkness, man, that they kind of touched a little bit in this one, and they go further and further into, especially in X-Men 2 and Logan and all that. He's a dark character, man. He's done some things that he doesn't want to do. He was forced to do, but man, him bringing that to life, and the way that he, grows out his sideburns, like the Wolverine did in the show and the comic, and he basically brought it to life. The only thing that he probably could have put on maybe more, I don't want to say more weight, give it that like Rhino the wrestler kind of look. That's kind of like that short, stocky look. That's kind of how I pictured Wolverine, but Jackman kind of took it and made his own, and he kind of got more jacked later on. They probably asked him to, because this is definitely like the thinnest we're ever going to see Wolverine in the whole Hugh Jackman line of movies. But he really like brought it to life and put so much care into the character, and like time and effort that he puts his body through. He knows that Wolverine made him who he is, and I know that like he always wants to go back to the fans and always like thank him for it. And I guess Logan, in the end, was kind of like his, farewell, which he kind of wanted anyway. And it was a perfect farewell to the character. And I felt like, to me, like, Hugh Jackman is this X-Men franchise. Once he's gone, it's like it's not the same franchise anymore. You might as well just make a new one. So I think we're at that point where now that he's gone, and we mentioned it a couple weeks ago on the first podcast, with this we could have our potential last X-Men franchise movie this year. And I think it should be it. And then we should just start fresh. Because nothing is going to, I don't know, despite all the continuity and stuff, without Hugh Jackman, it's done. You just got to start new. So that's the way I think of Hugh Jackman. I think he's just the star, more so than all the other characters. He's the only one to get an origin movie.
I think that is a huge problem with the franchise overall, is that they never really took the time to develop a lot of the other characters. I would argue that X-Men First Class went a long way in developing Professor Xavier and Magneto, but even then, you really didn't have that level of development like you have for Wolverine. Wolverine essentially gets 4 X-Men movies. He did a cameo in 2 others and 3 Wolverine movies, so there's a lot of story to be told there, and obviously so much of that impacts how we see a movie like Logan, and consider it to probably be one of the very best comic book movies ever made. But then you look at the rest of this cast, and you look at the way that the other characters are written, and it's really tough to evaluate Cyclops and Jean Grey, because they're not really characters. They're really important within the context of the X-Men in the comic. In the movies, Cyclops and Jean Grey are very much unimportant, and I think that's really unfortunate.
Storm gets it worse. She says nothing.
I mean,
she says nothing at all.
Halle Berry has a really terrible accent that needs to be emphasized. I don't know. I think she's going for like this vague African accent that does not work at all. But there is no charisma. There is absolutely nothing there from Halle Berry on Storm. I don't know whether the problem is the casting or the writing. It's probably some combination of both. But Cyclops, Jean Grey, and Storm are 3 characters who really get almost nothing to do here. And, Rogue at least gets a little bit more. Anna Paquin is somebody who has, been in movies. She's one of the youngest nominated actresses of all time. She was on the TV show True Blood, so she certainly has a career. But once you get past the first half of this movie, Rogue is kind of playing the damsel in distress almost, and we really don't get a lot with her. And I think that's really unfortunate, because I almost wonder if this is not a better movie if Rogue is the focus of it, and if Wolverine is kind of already implanted as an X-Men in some way, and you do small moments with Wolverine in the first one, and then the second one is where you more so do the big Wolverine movie, given that the character is so much an integral part of the second movie, even more so. But Patrick Stewart at least gets a lot to do as he plays Charles Xavier. And one of the best scenes in the movie is Patrick Stewart just expositioning on what the X-Men are and all their powers and whatnot.
Classic. I love that scene a lot.
There's a lot
classic.
of actors who could not pull that off, but Patrick Stewart does it marvelously.
I would go as far as to say that Patrick Stewart was more of a perfect casting than Wolverine. I mean, he was already bald. He already had the accent. And when I saw him, I was like, oh my God, like, this is Professor X. Like, they got Professor, like, I remember as a kid being like, oh my God, that's Professor X. He's already bald. And I knew he was from Star Trek, and I never watched Next Generation as a kid. I've seen this few episodes. I like the movies. I thought it was just like, wow, like, this is perfect. Like, they got it. And him, like, the way he carried himself and the way, like, he's the father figure to all the X-Men and he's their guiding light. And I think they got that down a lot. They got that down pretty well, because that's, like, the vibe that I got from the show. And then recently, I read a few of the comics, the Astonishing. I think it was Astonishing X-Men or something. It's very true to the character. Like, Patrick Stewart gets it, and he knows, like, at this point in Professor X's life, he's got to be there to be the teacher and lead them, and he's got to have the higher ground. He's got to have the higher moral ground, and I feel like you get that with him. But then, like you mentioned, like Jean Grey and Cyclops and Storm, they're just like nothing. I thought it was weird because, like, Cyclops was always, to me, like the leader of the group, and here he's so whiny and he's like not doing much, and he's just like, I feel like he gets in the way of things. And it felt like Jean Grey was more of the leader in this. I don't know how you feel about that, but she was the one who speaks to the Senate. She's the one who has to, like, help out with Cerebro eventually. You know what I mean? Like, she's more of, like, the central figure in the X-Men group as, like, leader.
I mean, they did a little bit of build up for the Phoenix in the first movie as well. There was a little bit of Phoenix that could be seen. So clearly they knew what they had in mind for Jean Grey by the third movie. Even at this Grey, at least you get some dialogue. You have this really creepy relationship with Wolverine that I don't believe it ever really worked. And yeah, Cyclops just not written very well at all. Let's talk about the villains. I particularly want to hear your thoughts on Ian McKellen's casting as a Magneto, because I really like Ian McKellen, and I think he has some good moments here, but overall, I was never really impressed with him as Magneto. I always felt like he was a little bit too old to be Magneto.
Yeah, I got that vibe too. But then I recently watched parts of an interview he did, and he said the reason that he was so wanted to be Magneto is because he's a gay person, and as a gay person, he relates to the whole, like, outcasting, and, like, because basically we kind of forget to mention that the X-Men were created during the Civil Rights Movement, and it's kind of like this representation of the Civil Rights Movement, like, for in the comics, right? For Stan Lee, he wanted to, like, bring that to the comics, and so he brought the X-Men, who were these people that were, you know, mutants, and they're, you know, they're kind of exiled from society, and they're kind of like, you know, they don't want, like, society was kind of turning their backs against them, and they just wanted to be part of society themselves, you know, very much like the Civil Rights Movement. So. And then it kind of reflects into this, basically. We kind of have to mention that, I feel.
Absolutely. And the dynamic that was always mentioned by Stan Lee is that Professor Xavier was the equivalent to a Martin Luther King, and Magneto was the equivalent to a Malcolm X, and sort of the different philosophies that accompanied what it meant to be those two civil rights leaders. You know, Professor Xavier was very much into nonviolence and trying to negotiate some sort of a peace with humanity and Homo sapiens, and Magneto's idea was that there was a war coming, and that ultimately it was going to have to be mutants that have to take the initiative and basically eliminate humans from existence. So you kind of have those those warring philosophies, and obviously because Bryan Singer is gay, you also have kind of that play into this movie as well. I think one of the unfortunate aspects of this franchise is that, you know, we really don't get a lot of female or characters of color are not emphasized all that much, and I think that is a huge weakness for a franchise that purports to be something that is about these issues. They don't really do a good job of showcasing, you know, Jean Grey and Storm and Rogue are kind of put to the sidelines, and you know, there are very few actors of color that are in any of these movies. And when we talk about one of the characters in X-Men First Class, it's going to be probably rock bottom for the franchise, I would say, as far as doing that. Yeah, I mean, I think that the franchise as a whole does not do a lot of the characters justice.
Yeah, I get that vibe too, and especially with Halle Berry being there, being the only, like, female black actors in the movie, and then having this be about like, you know, being rejected by society and that kind of thing, and just like the way that black people were treated in the 60s, and then having this whole like pseudo civil rights movement theme kind of going on, and yet she does nothing in the movie.
She's almost silent, which is hilariously ironic.
Yeah, for sure.
So when we talk about the villains, we are also talking about Mystique, Toad, and Sabretooth, who get very little to do. That's kind of the theme that we've been discussing. Mystique probably gets the most to do. She is an important character in this franchise. Brian, you may be more familiar with the comic than me, but it seems like even aside from the fact that Jennifer Lawrence was Mystique and they felt obligated to give her a whole lot to do, but it seems like even in these movies, Mystique is a much more important character than she ever was in the comics.
Well, I didn't read as much as the comics, but in the show, like, she's definitely more important in the movie than she was in the show. Like, the show, she would just kind of show up and be a foil to someone's plan or something. And I remember at the time, like, the big complaint I heard from, like, the people that did read the comic books was that she's supposed to be Nightcrawler's mom, right?
Yes.
And then in X-Men 2, Nightcrawler shows up as, like, something completely different. Like, you didn't stick to the comics. And then, of course, that's just fanboys being fanboys, you know, whatever.
That's fine. I mean, that really doesn't.
Yeah. But this is, like, it's kind of weird because I guess they didn't have lead female characters, and they did have the Jean Grey getting more dialogue. Yeah, she was, like, the counter Jean Grey, I guess, in this movie.
What they also have to do in all of these X-Men movies is find a way to neutralize Professor Xavier's powers, and they found a way to do it in every single movie that he's in.
Yeah.
The first one, it's Cerebro that takes him out. Mystique poisons Cerebro, and Professor Xavier is basically laid up for much of the third act of the film, and the rest of the X-Men are the one that have to go and make the save. And Xavier is basically in a hospital. That's
kind of like the thing in all of them, right? They either have to kidnap Professor X, like they did in X-2, X-3, they just killed him off 2/3 of the end of the movie, because he's definitely they even mentioned in Logan, Professor X, is the strongest mutant out of all of them, I guess, technically? Because he can kill all of them in a second.
They keep the running gag going even up until Logan.
Which is kind of smart. I mean, you would think all these different ways that he can just probably win the day because he's so powerful, yet they don't allow him to do it. So, here's what it is.
I mean, you almost have to, otherwise there's really no story to tell. Toad, something in Jean Grey's face, and that's the only useful thing I feel like he does.
Toad sucked, dude. Toad sucked. I hated Toad.
In the movie, or just in general, you don't like?
In the movie, I don't even remember Toad in the show. Honestly, like, he was so minor. They could have got other characters. I guess I don't know.
Part of X-Men Evolution, I do remember that.
Oh well, okay, X-Men Evolution, yeah. But in the original
animated series, no. He was not.
Yeah, it was just, he was not even that important. Sabretooth, I thought, was like a letdown.
They baned him.
And then they retconned him. They had to retcon him to fix him. Small side note that the guy who played Sabretooth was a wrestler. I forget his name. I think his name was Big Titan or some shit like that.
I think his real name is Tyler Bane, and he was...
He was in New Japan, for Christ's sake, I think.
Yes.
Jesus. But yeah, I actually met him once, surprisingly, in Reseda at the Legion Hall in 2001. Right after the movie came out. He was there for a wrestling show there. And he was in that VIP section, where they have that curtain. And there's that table behind the curtain, that round table. Before there was no curtain, it was just the VIP section. And that's where I saw Sabretooth. So, there you go.
He gets almost nothing to do, says nothing, gets into a couple fights, and is overall he's useless. I mean, it was actually shocking to see him dominate Wolverine at the end of this movie, because up until this point, he had just been completely obliterated. Like, multiple times. It was just a fool and a foil.
Yeah, he's definitely like Mongo. That's a reference for Mel Brooks fans out there.
Right. And, of course, there is Senator Kelly, who gets killed.
God, that so confused me as a kid. When you watched that, didn't you think, he's just going to come back as like a water creature or something?
I just thought the idea of killing Senator Kelly in the first movie was so stupid.
Yeah.
Why would you take that bullet out of the chamber? I mean, this is somebody who can be a consistent character for all of the movies as kind of the human voice of anti-mutant hysteria, and you basically just take him away right away. I thought that was going to be good. Yeah, and especially, like, he's got this legacy in the X-Men series of being, like, one of the main non-mutant villains, I guess you'd call him, right? Yes.
Him, maybe, like, Trask. It just feels like, why? Why did you kill him off? Randomly, in the middle of a sentence.
Yes.
Like, in the middle of a sentence.
Turn him into a mutant and then kill him.
Mid-sentence. It was
I have no
weird.
idea what the mutation was. Always very confusing to me, and I still can't quite figure.
Yeah, so were they all just gonna if okay, hypothetical spoiler to everybody, the movie's been out 18 years. If Magneto would have carried out his plan, everyone would have just turned into water creatures eventually or something and just melted?
I guess. I mean, the story of this movie is not... It's actually simple and straightforward. I will say that. I do like the twist that everybody thinks that they're going after Wolverine, but instead it's Rogue that they're actually going after.
That was good. That was good.
But, I mean, the plot is pretty forgettable.
Yeah, I mean, I forget what the machine's even called. I don't even know. Yeah, wasn't it going to kill Magneto if he... held on too long?
Magneto would have had to use all of his energy to... He basically would have had to pull Luke Skywalker from the end of Last Jedi.
I was about to say, yeah, all of his energy and then evaporate into...
die, but instead he was transferring his power to Rogue. Rogue was going to use the powers. And...
I do like that Rogue... They explained the Rogue's hair thing with that, and that was cool. I thought that was like, oh, the hair!
Yeah, that
was like a mark.
Cool.
That's one of those things for the marks, though. You know? Like, we'll give him this.
So yeah, Brian, I would say that the plot of this film is pretty nondescript. I mean, that's the best way to describe it. And I did appreciate the fact that it was only an hour and 45 minutes, whereas it feels like so many of these superhero movies now are over 2 hours, 2 hours 20, 2 hours and 30 minutes. So at least this movie got in and out very quickly. But there really isn't a whole lot to talk about when it comes to the actual story, because it's a pretty straightforward... It feels more like an episode of a TV show than a movie.
I was going to say the exact same thing, because nothing, like, the consequences are not really... We had more consequences at the ending of X-2, for sure. Like, what was going to happen? Like, maybe they should have killed off Jean in this one and then bring her back in the third one, maybe, and leave her completely out of X-2. That would have been a little interesting. I don't know, something like that, just to kind of, like... I don't know, X-Men 1 has, like, almost no significance, it feels like.
It's
other than its legacy.
5-minute prologue. I mean, that's what it feels like. X-2...
Yeah, that's what it does feel like.
X-2 is really the first X-Men movie. And I've always believed that X-Men does not work as a film franchise because there are way too many characters to try to get across. And I truly believe that if X-Men was a TV show, a live-action TV show, with really high production values... that would be the best thing for everyone involved. And I'm not talking about The Gifted. I'm talking about like a real X-Men, whether it's streaming or on Netflix.
Yeah, I've been wanting that for so long. I kind of pictured that when they talked about that X-Men show, and then they turned it into The Gifted, and I was just like, I don't care. Like, no one cares about that. Give us what the fans want. Give us the suits. Give us, like, the characters. Give us, like, the storylines from the show and translate it from the animated show. Like, that's the money. Like, the money's in the animated show. And a lot of the producers, I don't think, get that. And then... I
mean, I don't even necessarily know if it's in the animated show, but I think it's with that concept. I think it's with having a group of characters that you care about. And, again, it doesn't necessarily have to encompass Wolverine, but I think that if you look at not just the original animated series, but if you watch X-Men Evolution and even Wolverine and the X-Men, those two shows were actually much better done than a lot of the X-Men movies were, too.
Yeah, and that was what, X-Men and Wolverine and the X-Men, that was so limited. That was like a 2-season run.
Yeah, they did not have a very long run, but that was a very well-done show. I would even say, you know, people are very nostalgic for the original. I would say Wolverine and the X-Men was a better animated show.
Really?
Yes.
Wow, that's saying a lot. Because I remember watching that, I was like, wow, I've never seen Wolverine in this, like, central role where he's not out for himself. He's, like, guiding people and being, like, the Professor X. It was kind of weird, but it was, like, a new, fresh take. That's what I got from it. But I can see what you're saying in terms of that. I think people want... This is my thing. I think people want that feeling that the show gave them. They just haven't figured out how to translate that yet, but I think... If you give, like, MCU that property, they can give us that feeling again. Look at Guardians, right? If you look at Guardians, you had to introduce 5 characters, right? And they got it done. Here, you could have just introduced 5 of the X-Men, and that was it, and give them some kind of, like, context or whatever. Or maybe it was just them having their first mission or something, but it just feels like they could have done a lot more with the characters coming together and... Instead of just focusing on one, and then, you know, it goes all over the place.
For sure. And when we talk about the visuals, this is a very dark movie. Not Not in the literal sense. I mean, there's definitely some comedy, and this doesn't feel too heavy, but man, this movie is just so muted all the time. There's a lot of blues.
And a lot of gray.
A lot of silvers. It's just
yeah.
very visually uninteresting, and I know that this is the year 2000, but there's just nothing to this. And this is a pretty drab color scheme, and that is also reflected in the uniforms as well. There's even a joke made by Cyclops about asking Wolverine whether he would rather wear yellow spandex, and I was like, I mean, it's better than what you're wearing now.
Give me the yellow spandex. Yeah, I know that exact line. I've had that exact same reaction whenever I hear that line. Yeah, give me the fucking yellow and blue spandex, man, with the horn.
I will even accept the brown and orange uniform.
Oh, God. Yeah, I know what you mean. But at least First Class picked up on that, and they gave us those 60s bright yellow suits. At least I give Matthew Vaughn, I think, gets it, but I don't think he's coming back to the X-Men franchise.
Even Magneto's costume, if you look at Magneto's costume in this film versus X-Men Days of a Future Past, it's much more colorful. And I know that
I know.
Probably shouldn't matter. It's a comic book. I mean, it's supposed to be something that is visually interesting and visually engaging. And I think the problem with a lot of these comic book movies, and I'm particularly calling out a lot of the MCU movies, is a lot of them don't seem to have a very particular visual style. I think they're starting to do a better job of it in recent movies, but when you have a comic book movie like this, you really have to have a very clear scheme and have something that is visually interesting to look at.
Yeah, you look at Guardians, and they took the complete opposite approach, you know? They brightened everything up in space, and they made everything look like borderline Technicolors on some of the scenes. And here, everything is like you said, muted down. And compared to the show, everything was so colorful and bright. But I think because The Matrix was such a big thing in '99, that I think they felt like, oh, this is what the people want now, so we got to dress them up like a dude from The Matrix. And that's kind of what the vibe I got the whole time. Every time I see these suits, I hate them. It just makes me think of The Matrix. And Matrix is good on its own kind of thing, but man, these suits are just so thoughtless and so plain, and it feels like they almost abandoned the suits right by the third one, or they kind of just no, they didn't actually. When I think about it, some of the newer ones, I think Ellen Page,
the whole trilogy, basically.
Yeah, it sucks.
And I hope you like blue and gray and white, because we get a lot more of that in X-Men too.
Yes, especially with the snow and all that shit and the silver machinery kind of vibe going on. Yeah, for sure. That's definitely a weakness, I think, in these movies, because the whole aspect and the appeal is brightness and vivid and colorful. I don't know why they took that out. I guess The Matrix was just such a big thing that it's man, we gotta dress them up in tight gray, black-ish, suits that are not really visually appealing.
So obviously that is one of the legacies of this film, is that we have these wonderful leather suits that nobody likes. But it did give Marvel some momentum. This was a financial box office success, mostly because of the fact that you're finally putting the X-Men on the screen. And even though the story is pretty nondescript, there are definitely some positive elements. You do have Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. You have Patrick Stewart as Professor Xavier. I think this movie is generally watchable, but it's also very forgettable. But ultimately, when we look at the positives, it has spawned an entire franchise, and I think it really gave Marvel the confidence that these movies are going to be a really important aspect of their business model for the next century, and not getting away from the comic books, but kind of expanding their brand, so to speak, was going to be really important. And I think those are all of the things that I think this movie does for as far as the legacy goes.
Yeah, without the success of this, wow, where would we be at? We would have no MCU, right? No MCU.
It'd be really hard to see an MCU without this, and I think that Marvel desperately needed a success like this, even though they're not directly benefiting from X-Men's success. Indirectly, I think this starts to get the wheels turning on a potential cinematic universe for them, and it would take another 10 years or so for that to fully develop with Iron Man, but selling off your properties only gets you so far. I mean, at this point, because of what they've been able to do with the MCU, Marvel's is a real powerhouse, and they have a lot of influence and a lot of power within the industry, and we can debate whether that's positive or negative, but the fact is that the MCU is what's really driving a lot of the ticket sales now.
Yeah, absolutely. They had 3 of the top grossing movies in 2017.
We're not even talking about their A franchise. I mean, again, we're not talking about the X-Men. We're not really talking about even Iron Man. We are talking about Guardians of the Galaxy, Thor 3, and Spider-Man Homecoming. And Spider-Man Homecoming was going to have some real struggles because of the previous 2 films not being very well regarded.
Yeah, they took, a franchise in Thor that people kind of gave up on after, Thor 2.
Gave up, I think, is the wrong word for that. I think people were, I would say, unenthused about the franchise at best.
I didn't think we were going to get a third Thor movie, actually, to be honest. I thought they were just going to do, they're going to find out that Loki's still owed, and then Loki's going to have to be, taken out in the next Avengers movie or something. I really thought they were not going to do a third Thor movie.
The second one was successful enough to where they would do a third one. I think they knew, though, that the second one didn't work.
For sure. But yeah, you can't have these kind of successes without X-Men. So it all kind of ties in back to that. It's in terms of legacy, it all starts it doesn't start with X-Men, but for Marvel in general, more importantly, Marvel, this is their first big success. And then after that, they would, go on to do Spider-Man, which would kind of elevate their confidence even more.
20th Century Fox was behind the X-Men franchise, and obviously Sony was behind the very first Spider-Man movie.
Yeah, and do you think Spider-Man would be as big if it wasn't for X-Men?
I think if Spider-Man had come out first, I don't think the X-Men had any influence on Spider-Man. I think Spider-Man was a very popular character independent of the X-Men.
Interesting.
I think a lot of what drove Spider-Man's success is the fact that I think Tobey Maguire was a very popular actor at that point. I think people were really interested in his success. I think film geeks really like Sam Raimi. I think that's part of what drove it. And I think you just had a really crowd-pleasing romance with Kirsten Dunst and Tobey Maguire. I think that's what made that film successful. What I think made the X-Men successful, I think part of it was nostalgia for the animated series, but I also think bringing in Patrick Stewart helped. You had a director who, from a film perspective, had some credibility. You had Ian McKellen in there, and you really just had a bunch of unknowns, but I think Hugh Jackman really jumped off the screen right from the start.
Yeah, I for sure agree on that one.
Let's get to the burning questions. Who is the MVP of this film?
I gotta say co-MVP, because looking at this now, it's Patrick Stewart just made the show almost real to me. Seeing him the way he talked and the way with the accent, and he was already bald and he carried himself and he was in the wheelchair that really gets to me, man. Especially now when I watched Logan earlier in the year, it really comes full circle with that for me, because those were the 2 characters that really characters for me. And of course the other one I'm talking about is Wolverine. Those are the 2 MVPs for me. And I love how in Logan they go back to that, that core relationship those 2 have, and they touch on that relationship starts here. And something about Patrick Stewart, man, just the way he carries himself as Xavier, he breathes life into that character, and he he cares about that character. You can tell he really puts his all, and then it becomes this big payoff with the character in Logan. So those are my 2 MVPs.
The Wolverine-Xavier dynamic is something that plays out over all of the movies, and it's something that we're definitely going to be focusing on. Even X-Men Days of the Future Past, that is a relationship that is very important to that film as well. I would say I think Patrick Stewart is really the MVP of the first movie. I'm not going to cop out and say 2 people. I'm really going to say that it's Patrick Stewart. I think he really has to carry a lot of the exposition load, and that is not always something that's easy, and there are not a lot of actors who can successfully do what he did. And I think for this first movie, you really needed Patrick Stewart, especially in the first half, to really make this into something special. But what does it say that there are really only 2 contenders? I mean, I feel like the X-Men should have 10 contenders with all the quality of these characters, and we have 2.
Well, Magneto, I think he gets it. I think, but we get more into that Magneto character once we get the Michael Fassbender interpretation, right. And we Michael get really Fassbender into that. It was
a fantastic casting decision.
Yeah, he's the best Magneto, for sure. That leads to the burning question number 2. Was Ian McKellen the best choice? Man, that's tough because like I can picture Jeremy Irons, I can picture Liam Neeson. I think Ewan McGregor was too young at the time, somewhere around there. But it did give you this idea that man, there is this history there because Ian McKellen was so old going into it, and Patrick Stewart. I mean, you can barely tell with Patrick Stewart being bald and shaving his head, but it makes it seem like there's this long-standing history there. And we got to talk about that scene in the beginning. To me, that scene in the beginning is like that sets the tone of what it should be about this whole series. And we're talking about that scene where Magneto's separated from his parents at that concentration camp, and then all of a sudden you start seeing the gate move, and he doesn't realize what he's doing. And then they go back to that in First Class. I thought that was brilliant.
I think it works much better in First Class.
Yeah.
I mean, hindsight is 20/20 in a situation like this. I don't necessarily know if it works in this movie, but in First Class it is 100% appropriate and
absolutely
totally made sense in the context of that film. I'm not sure if it was as effective in this one.
Yeah, best choice, I don't know, because I can easily see, like I said, Liam Neeson stepping in, and because he's got that size too. The thing with Ian McKellen is he kind of loses that size if you kind of compare, if you want to believe into the fact that he was Michael Fassbender looking at some point, right? But he does lose the size. But that would have been a little more believable, I think, with Liam Neeson. But yeah, was he the best? I don't know. I don't think so. Looking back now, I think he's the best choice to play an older Magneto for sure. But
yes.
But a 50-year-old Magneto, I don't know.
Absolutely. How much better of an ensemble is this film if Stormer and Cyclops are written and performed better? And specifically what I'm getting at is, do you think it's the writing or the performances that are the problem?
Oh, it's the writing. Like, Cyclops is just not Cyclops. He's not the leader that he should be. Cyclops was like always the leader of the X-Men, and despite how much he argued with like Wolverine and stuff, like they followed his, like he was the Captain America of the X-Men, right? That's what Cyclops should be, like the leader, the tactical leader. But they just made him look like a jock in this one, I think. You never really get that Cyclops ever. The Cyclops that I refer to, like the one from the comic and the show. You never really get that in any of these movies at all. He's just like complaining.
He's still the leader.
Even in the show, like the whining wasn't even that like thing. He was just like pissed at Wolverine for trying to get at his girl. And they do that here, but like it comes off like this high school shit that doesn't really, in the hindsight of it all, like it does play to the Logan character because that's one of his driving forces towards the end in his later movies. And I get that, but the way that Scott Summers is just portrayed, it's like it's so.
James Marsden was not the right choice to cast. I think that's part of the problem.
And it's not like he's a bad actor because for certain roles he's good. Like he's good in like that Prince role. And what was that? The Amy Adams princess movie, Enchanted.
Yes.
Yeah, he was good at that.
He was also like, very good in Westworld too.
Ooh, I've not seen any season one of Westworld yet, so it's on my list.
Yeah, he's very good in that. I mean, I don't think he's any good in the superhero genre. He wasn't also say Superman Returns either.
Yeah, that was okay. This was 18 years ago. Sometimes it just takes some time for these guys to get to a certain level. Like Brad Pitt sucked in the 90s. Let's just say it now, and then. It took him a while, and then he got good. So it happens, and James Marsden was very young at the time. Man, a lot of this cast still looks the same, which is kind of crazy. 18 years later, James Marsden, he looks the same. Hugh Jackman kind of looks the same, obviously. Patrick Stewart looks the same because he's still bald and whatever. Ian McKellen shows his wear and tear now, but yeah, this cast kind of holds the test of time.
Still looks good too.
She does. I don't know. It was weird because in one of the interviews, she said like she likes having this central role or something, like how she's kind of like in the background, quote unquote, and just kind of there. And she's like, I don't have to worry about whatever. And then in the later movie, she's complaining about not having enough screen time. You know what I mean? It's like.
So when you say the muted color scheme hurts the overall visuals of the film,
that's one of my biggest things is the suit's just terrible. It's so fucking terrible. I don't mind the special effects they use because I really like the scene on the train where Magneto's bending him back with the metal and the claws. I love that scene a lot. It's more like old school movie magic kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like not really a lot of CGI. It's just like you got to lift the guy up and then you got to forcibly do some things with the metal and the claw. That's kind of like practical effect kind of thing. I like that. But then some of the CGI at the end was kind of weird. Like, I don't know why, like, the machine that they're using has, like, all this white glow coming out of it. I don't understand that. I think that was just, like, a visual choice, I guess, or they just ran out of money. But some of it was kind of weird. And then some of it was kind of cheap. Like, if you look at the fight scenes in this compared to X2, completely different.
Absolutely. And would the X-Men function better as a TV show?
Oh, God, yes. I've been saying this for so long. Like, they should just do a live-action show. You don't have to give us all the characters every week. Obviously, work on a budget, but if you look at what Flash and Arrow and Supergirl and what they've been able to do, Legends of Tomorrow even, that's pretty much an X-Men right there without the whole, context of, like, the social injustice and, social war kind of going on, right? It's just a group of guys coming together and having adventures, right? That's kind of like, sort of like X-Men, but if you just mix in with some better writing, you can incorporate that and you can get that. Like, it's possible to do this as a show nowadays. Like, I don't know why that they have to do, like, we have to tell this story about some random family. We have to tell the story of Magneto's son. We have to tell this story about this nobody. Like, that's not what people want. Just give us what we want. It's not that hard.
It's the same thing with there's a Krypton prequel that's going to be on the Sci-Fi Network.
Yeah, don't get me started.
You want to talk about a show that nobody will possibly care about.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know if it's tone deaf. I don't know if it's just producers trying to make a quick buck. This is definitely, like, a show material kind of thing. Like, I can see this on HBO and getting, like, a darker tone and getting some extra money. I could see Netflix going after this and be like, you know what, why don't we try it,
Disney, I'll tell you what, Disney has a streaming service coming in 2019.
Yeah, I was about to mention that, and I would rather see X-Men as a show like a Daredevil, like a Luke Cage kind of show. Yeah. More episodic, more writing. That way you get to develop these characters more. You can still have your edginess to it with because Netflix, you can do whatever you want, obviously, right? Or the streaming services.
If you want, you can do whatever you want.
You can do whatever you want. So you can just have this show and have it be what the fans want, and you can still incorporate it into. You can make its own universe if you want to. You can tie it in with the MCU if you want to. Like, there's a lot of options on the table, because it's just like, if it was one X-Men, right, and the whole focus was on Wolverine the whole time, then yeah, it's a movie. But because of all these characters and all these stories, like, it's just so much to tell. Like, maybe even go as far as, like, make a movie eventually, but do a show first. I mean, people have tried that. I know Dark Tower tried that and just failed miserably. You put some thought into it, you can connect them together. Like, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., I think, low-key is one of the better, smarter decisions that Marvel's been made. You know what I mean? Like, to put that show on the air, to give the context and the filler for the fans that are just diehards, that are just trying to, like, get their Marvel fill and connect all the dots, like, that's perfect for that.
But even Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., I think, took too long to develop, and I think a lot of people gave up on it.
I gave up on it. I'm not going to lie, I gave up on it, but at least, like, it's a concept that you can connect a show to a movie universe, and it's very possible to do that. And X-Men can easily do that, but they just want to make it complicated for some reason. Like, I think I don't know if you've seen the trailer for New Mutants. I think it's just a bad idea. Like,
it's a horror movie, right?
Yeah. No one wants an X-Men horror movie. They want the X-Men. No one wants, like, these horror, like...
I think that they are trying to experiment with different genres. Just as Deadpool was more of a comedy, Logan was a Western. I think Fox is trying to... Because Marvel is Marvel, and you're not going to out-Marvel them. I think they're really they're trying to see what works and what doesn't. And I think there is the potential for New Mutants to work as a horror movie. I mean, I think a comic book movie can work in any genre. It just depends on who the director is, how well it's written. If you were to tell me that there was going to be a Deadpool movie starring Ryan Reynolds after the 3 previous Ryan Reynolds movies I saw, I would have said, that's not going to work. But you have the right director, you have the right writer, you have the right supporting cast, and Deadpool's really good. It's the same thing with Logan. James Mangold is the same director. He also directed the second Wolverine movie, which I don't think was that great. He also directed Hugh Jackman in Kate and Leopold, which is not a great movie. But he also directed him in Logan because, he got to do what he wanted. There was a better script. So I think it just depends. I think it can work.
I don't know. I think it could work if it's characters that we're familiar with, but they're just throwing this at us with like new random characters. And to me, it's just like, I'm not going to see this. I don't think I'm going to see that movie. I just have no connection to it.
I would also be curious to know what the budget is for that movie, because if it's cheaply budgeted, then it really is just them experimenting with a different genre.
I get that. I totally get that. And especially with a movie like, I think Get Out kind of like was like, we're going to put this movie together. We're going to release it. We have no budget. And then they were like, oh, you can make movies off of, no budget movies nowadays. People forget that. I think producers in Hollywood have forgotten that notion. As you can still make
I mean, we could have an entire conversation, but Blumhouse basically will let a director do whatever they want for $5 million or less, and what happens is you get Split, you get Out, and you also get a host of other horror genre movies that they have helped produce, and I think Universal does the distribution.
Yeah, so it's possible. I mean, they can make money on this for sure, and they're going to make their quick buck. But New Mutants, I don't know. And then we talked about possibly the last X-Men movie, right? The Dark Phoenix. I think that we're at the end of this universe as a whole, coming up at the end of the year. I'm hoping, and we can just start fresh, and we either get a show or we get a movie that that the director gets, and they got to pick a director that, I don't know, maybe Matthew Vaughn gets him more than any of the X-Men directors, I think. Maybe even more than James Mangold, because that Logan is more of like a Western last ride of the gunslinger kind of movie to me, right?
Right.
More so than anything.
It would be very difficult to bring James Mangold back.
Yeah. So I think Matthew Vaughn is the guy, and you just got to give him the rights, and you got to tell him, hey, we want the colors, we want everything from the 90s, either a show or a movie, go. And that's what they need to do, I think.
I mean, I think you have to look at what Marvel's done, and you have to try to do something different. And I think doing something different means doing a TV show. I think that's the only, because, like I said, they've got the formula down, and it's going to be really difficult to try to counter that with anything except being different. And if that means trying to look at different genres, even, I think that's where success is coming from. Well, we have completely fallen off the rails here. We're not even talking about the original X-Men, and that probably says a lot about the quality and the forgettability of this film. So let's talk about our scores. So for Heroes, I gave X-Men a 7.
Same with me, 7 on that one.
Villains, I gave it a 6.
Villains, I gave a 7 only because Ian McKellen gets it. Like, he gets the heart of that character.
Story, I gave it a 7, and I feel like that's a little high, but...
Yeah, I'm giving a 6 on that one.
Understandable. Visuals, I gave it a 6.
That's tough, man, because as bad as I hate the suits, I do like the look of Mystique, man. Like, really, they got that down. So I go with a 6.
I actually like the design of Cerebro in the mansion, too, and that's probably one of the reasons I'm giving it a 6. I also like the design of the claws. Actually, the first half hour of this movie, the visuals are actually pretty good. With Wolverine in the cage at first, and then they go in the car in the snow. I actually think the first half hour of this is pretty good.
Yeah, I can see that. And I didn't like the way that they looked at the Senate, though. God, the Senate looked bad, too.
Not good. It didn't look like the Senate.
Yeah, it had its own weird look to it, too.
And Legacy, I gave this an 8.
Same with me. Legacy, definitely an 8, because, like I said, it was the first X-Men movie. That was what brought people to the dance. It brought me to the dance. I went and saw this movie twice. Even though I knew it wasn't, like, an amazing experience, I just wanted to see the X-Men on screen. And that's the legacy of it.
All right. My total score is 34, so for me, this does not make the cut.
Yeah, 34 here, too, so that's kind of what I guessed, around the 60s that this would get overall, 68.
68, which I think makes sense. I think this is... I have very little problem with this getting a 68 and missing... I mean, this missed it by a lot, actually.
Yeah, this was no way going in the upper echelon. Like,
I think this is more important with hindsight than it actually is as an individualized production.
Yeah, it's not great. Let's just say that. It's decent. And it's a good movie to watch on TV when you got nothing to do.
And it's clear by the fact that we spent a lot of our time not talking about the actual movie. Regarded as one of the best sequels in superhero movies of the early aughts, we return to the X-Men franchise for the first time in just about a year with X-2, X-Men United.
I feel a great swell of pity for the poor soul who comes to that school looking for trouble. What's happened to you? Don't you remember?
You should have killed me when you had the chance!
Kill him, Bobby!
No!
Welcome, Professor.
You haven't told him about his past.
Who is he?
I can't remember.
Sometimes anger can help you survive.
The war has begun. Eric, what have you done?
This is the Superhero Pantheon. On this podcast, we take one superhero film a week and decide whether it should be in the Pantheon, the pile of shame, or somewhere in between. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and all of your other favorite podcast apps through the real world. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5 star review so as to help people discover this show and the great work that the folks at the real world are doing. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you could do so in 2 ways. First, send an email to superheropantheon@gmail.com. Second, find us on Twitter at Hero Pantheon. My co-host for this week and every week will be Brian DeBrain. He can be found on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. And Brian, we have not discussed an X-Men movie in just about a year since our Ryan Reynolds month, and we discussed Wolverine Origins. We also have discussed the first X-Men movie, which, if I'm editing this correctly, you will be able to hear that episode before you hear this one. But Brian, X-2 is generally regarded as one of the first great superhero movies. It is, of course, a sequel, but unlike so many other of the sequels to the superhero movies, this one is almost inarguably better than the first one in a lot of ways. It is bigger, the cast is bigger, we get to see a lot more mutant powers. Everything just, I think, feels a little bit bigger in so many different ways. And I think that this and Spider-Man 2 generally compete for the best spot, so to speak, as far as this decade of superhero movies goes. And Brian, I know that this is a period of time that is very important to you, going back to X-Men 2. It is for me. Here's a fun fact for you, Brian. The first time I saw this movie was the day of my senior prom.
Wow, I remember seeing it opening day, like right after school, and being with my friends, and that was the first time I think that a theater was like cheering, you know what I mean, for certain scenes, because it was so cool, like the Nightcrawler scene, all that kind of thing. I remember that theater having a lot of buzz that day. And that was one of the first times that a superhero movie came out and the audience was like electric for it. You know what I mean? It wasn't even like that for Spider-Man 1. And this was a year after that. So I think the buzz was starting to grow with all these superhero movies. And once this came out, this was the first one. I mean, this was clearly better than the first X-Men movie. So, I mean, once you come out with X2, it kind of sets the standard that Spider-Man 2 would kind of like top the next year. But for a good year, between 2003 and the summer of 2004, this was regarded as probably one of the best superhero movies ever. And there wasn't a lot, maybe compared to Superman 1, Batman 1. But, I mean, it has a lot of elements that still holds up. Some of the elements don't hold up as much because of age and, you know, perspective and comparing things to the MCU now. But, you know, for 2003, this was a really exciting time. And I remember leaving the theater. That was the first time, I think, also that leaving the theater, like, man, I want to watch this movie again. And that kind of feeling of wanting to watch a superhero movie again to kind of intake everything. And then, of course, you know, talking with my teachers who at the time were 90s X-Men fans, because this was 2003. So that was kind of cool talking with some of my teachers about it. And you're like, did you pick up on the ending? Did you know what's coming at the end? It's the Phoenix. And then, of course, X-Men 3 came out.
Right, and you would have had to have talked to your teachers at this point, because even though the internet existed in 2003, the monoculture surrounding these movies and the YouTube rabbit holes. I mean, those just simply did not exist. And even though the internet has been around for well over 20 years, I think we've really only seen this kind of culture develop around something over the last decade or so with the social media and your magazine articles and your online articles, kind of the explainers to some of these things. I mean, think about it. The fact that Avengers Endgame came out and practically the day that it opened, there were already discussions of what was coming next and kind of explaining things that were going on. But in this case, I mean, if you did not know who the Phoenix was, then you would assume that Jean Grey is dead and you would not understand what was in the water at the end of the movie. And that's something that I'll kind of address in the burning questions. Like I said, I saw this the day of my senior prom in a very early morning screening of this particular movie, and it was exhilarating. I mean, this was the movie that I really wanted from the X-Men as somebody who was a fan of the animated series of the 90s, of course, and kind of dabbling in comic books, especially the X-Men. They were generally always my favorite Marvel characters for such a long time, and I enjoyed X-Men for what it was, but it definitely was missing something. This, I felt like, was kind of a reward and a payoff to so many of the things that were set up in the first one. And just getting to see all of the things that you mentioned, but also getting to see the fact that this movie had a bigger budget, $50 million more, and it shows. It really does. You can see the budget right from the start. I think the Nightcrawler scene at the very beginning when he is teleporting from place to place in the White House, that is the best sequence that is in any of the first two movies. And right away you can see kind of the differences. This movie was also 30 minutes longer, and that is also something that was needed. I think when you have so many characters and when you have a team of mutants like this, you absolutely have to do this kind of thing. One of the other cool things that I really liked is that they did this thing with the freezing of people. That's something that Xavier is able to do, and in this case, they used actual mimes who are used to not moving to do that. So I think that's also a really cool thing. And as far as Nightcrawler, of course, it would be Alan Cumming playing the role. And Neil Patrick Harris originally auditioned for the role but lost out. I think Alan Cumming was a much better choice, just as far as being able to kind of get the more subtle parts of it. When I think of Neil Patrick Harris, I tend to think a little bit bigger, a little bit more bombastic, and I think Alan Cumming does a really good job. And I know that we're kind of going through the notes right now, but just in talking about that opening scene and the way that they nailed it from a visual perspective, from a technical perspective, I still think it looks really good. And I think the way that Nightcrawler is rendered, especially compared to what he looks like even in Dark Phoenix, I think Nightcrawler looks really, really good.
Yeah, he was like the highlight of this movie for me. And it sucks that they never brought him into X-Men 3, and that's what really disappointed me about X-Men 3, and the idea that the prosthetic makeup was just too much. And for 2003, I was just blown away that they had this great character because of the not necessarily the budget, but the time and the effort to put into the character, considering that Hellboy would come out, a year later. I don't know, it just kind of rubbed me the wrong way that they had this great character and it's kind of a subtle, great performance, because I feel like there's a lot that, he's kind of like a soft kind of person, but when he's kind of like mind controlled at the beginning, he's this really aggressive, violent character. And the way they kind of wrote him out is that he wasn't into the whole violent lifestyle of the X-Men. That's why he doesn't appear in X-Men 3. But to me, like, that opening sequence was just electric. And that was the first time that the audience started clapping in the theater right when that sequence ended. So I remember that clearly. And I was just thinking, like, man, this is a great way to open a movie. And then, his character development was really well done, I thought. I thought him not tying together with the idea that his mom is supposed to be Mystique, because I knew after that, like, people were complaining, like, oh, they didn't tie it together, blah blah blah. And of course, the whole no internet thing, and I kind of remembered it from the show, but I mainly remembered the Phoenix stuff from the show. But yeah, I thought that they probably should have tied it together, knowing now that we know that Mystique can live for God knows how long. It would have made sense, but at the time they really want to connect it. But I think Alan Cumming did a great job, and I love the makeup and all the effects they did. And it just sucks they didn't bring him back. So.
Absolutely, and Bryan Singer credits the X-Men graphic novel God Loves, Man Kills, which was released in 1982 as an influence for the script. As in the movie, the novel concerns William Stryker. In the comic book, though, he is a religious leader instead of a military one, and I want to get your thoughts on that in just a minute. They build a replica of Cerebro and kidnap Professor Xavier so he can use it to kill all mutants, and of course the X-Men are also forced to ally themselves with Magneto to stop him. That is exactly what happens in this second movie. Of course, there were some changes that we'll get into. But yes, William Stryker is an army colonel in the movie who perceives mutants as a threat, but in the comics, he was a Christian fundamentalist televangelist who uses religion and his sacred belief of all mutants being satanic to rally anti-mutant bigotry. He even set up his own hate group in the comics called the Purifiers to eliminate mutants in a holy crusade. The change was likely meant to avoid religious controversy. I really wish that they had been religious leaders, because I think that is an issue that permeates society right now, dealing with religious extremism. And I almost wish that we could have gotten that, because how many times have we gotten the generic military bad guy? That is something that we see in movies all over the place. And as we are recording this is the same week that the Sonic the Hedgehog trailer was revealed, and even that movie just has generic evil army henchmen. And as much as I like Brian Cox, after reading about this background, I kind of wanted to see what it would be like if he was a religious leader instead.
Yeah, I'm definitely feeling that idea, and that sounds like a much more deep idea. But the problem is, I think 2003, the audiences were not ready for that, because it was still like too casual. Some of the audience wasn't as spartaned up as like an audience today would see a movie. So I think 2003 it would have been a little too much, but now it would have been perfect for it. Like if they would have kind of rewrote this Dark Phoenix movie into something like that and kind of reintroduced Stryker, I think that would have been a much better approach. But I think Brian Cox was just so great in this movie. He's the best performance in this movie. And it's kind of weird that like my first experience watching Brian Cox was probably this, I think. And then right after this, I saw Super Troopers. And I was like, this is the same guy? Like, I couldn't believe the range that Brian Cox had, you know what I mean? So credit to him for making this role work. I just feel like if they did the religious angle, he would have still knocked it out of the park, because he's such a talented actor. But I think 2003, the audiences were not ready for that. But it is a great concept to kind of build on, and the religious aspect to it, because there's definitely some religious stuff that you kind of pick up on in X-Men 3 a little bit. I don't know if you kind of get where I'm at with that, kind of like that whole, like, you know, gathering all everyone in the forest in X-Men 3, but that's the kind of vibe that I kind of got from that.
Oh yes, and we will discuss that when we talk about X-Men 3, The Last Stand, next week. Of course, another connection with the X-Men and kind of the treatment of minorities, even though the X-Men franchise infamously does not treat minorities very well. There is this big scene of Bobby Drake playing Iceman, telling his parents that he is a mutant, and Sir Ian McKellen helped to write that scene and make it look more like a coming out scene, and that's clearly what they were going for, and I think it was very successful. I think there are a number of really excellent, well done set pieces and scenes throughout this, but something that you will not see in this movie is Stan Lee. Stan Lee, who is the creator of the original comics, did not appear. He did not appear in Days of the Future Past, X-Men Origins, or X-Men First Class. So it's very interesting that this kind of a historical note, especially coming off the fact that we just saw Stan Lee's last cameo appearance. We did not see him in this movie, and we will not see him in many X-Men movies to come.
Yeah, and I guess that was meant to be, you know, like around this time, people really didn't think of Stan Lee to be an appearance in a movie kind of thing, and that was kind of like a later thing that kind of developed through probably Iron Man and all that kind of thing, even though he's doing cameos before that, we mentioned before. But it's kind of weird because we're just so used to it, you know what I mean? And I don't even think it would work in like the X-Men movies, because his personality doesn't quite fit the X-Men universe, if you get what I'm saying. Like, he's too happy for the X-Men universe to kind of appear, smile, and have a cameo, you know what I mean? It would have to be a really dark scene to have a cameo like that. Even when Wolverine had a cameo in Days of Futures Past, he told him to go fuck off, you know what I mean? So cameos in X-Men movies tend to be a little dark and a little vulgar.
Yes, that was X-Men First Class, which we will be talking about in about 2 weeks or so, and that is something that I'm very much looking forward to. Let's get to talking about the heroes of this movie. I am appreciative of the fact that Storm, Jean, and Cyclops got a little bit more to do this time, but still not as much as they deserve because, of course, these are three of the most important X-Men historically. Going back to the original team, Cyclops and Jean were part of that. Storm is a long-term character who's been around for over 40 years at this point. Cyclops and Storm are also kind of the leaders of the team and have been leaders of the team at different points. So it's really unfortunate that Wolverine is still so much the centerpiece, as he is the one that protects the students. We get to see him use his Berserker Rage for the first time. This is not something we really saw in the first X-Men, but it was definitely something that we got during the school, when the school was being raided, and even that was very much toned down because there was no blood, but there was a lot of stabbing that was going on, and we would get some of that in Logan. We would get the graphicness and some of the bloodiness, but at least we did get some of Wolverine unfiltered, so to speak, even though at the sacrifice of Storm, Jean, and Cyclops. We also have Xavier getting taken out, which is something that has been very common in these X-Men movies because he is literally the most powerful mutant. So unfortunately, you kind of have to do these kinds of things. And as far as you've also got Nightcrawler as well, who we've talked about. What are your thoughts on kind of the heroes of this movie, particularly Wolverine, who so much of this is focused on, but Jean and Cyclops as well?
Man, I feel like Storm, Halle Berry just had like the most useless dialogue. It was mainly just exposition, and just like the dialogue she was given was not given to her like developing your character. You know what I mean? It was just like her to kind of regurgitate what needs to be done in the plot. And that's kind of what Storm just had for the movie. And I was just kind of disappointed looking back. Like she could have had more to do, but she was just there to further the plot. And really her character was just kind of like in the background. And even at the end when like Jean dies, like she's hardly reacting. I feel like, I don't know if that's just the way Singer directed her or whatever, but same thing with Femke Janssen. It felt like Jean Grey. I don't know. She's just so emotionless in this movie. And I don't know what it is. She seems kind of bored. But I think the strength of the heroes is definitely with Wolverine in this movie. He carries it. There's a lot of focus on him. He's like the only one where we get like a background of any of the characters. So in terms of that, he's carrying it. And he's in a lot of the scenes. I think he's probably got most of the screen time, come to think of it. And he is the star. Like if you coming out of X-Men 1, everyone was just into Wolverine and Hugh Jackman, and he was kind of the star of that. So that was kind of the focus and the shift. And I understand it because like the way these characters are being portrayed, it just... there's not as much energy coming from Cyclops, Jean, and Storm, and I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's the casting. I know these actors are good. I mean, I love Femke Janssen in Goldeneye. She was so much more energetic in that, but in this one, and maybe even the X-Men 1 to an extent, just her energy level's not there. But I don't know. It just seems weird, but Xavier, he's really good in this as well. He's always really great. I do feel like Xavier was just kind of like weak in the movie because he just basically went from the school to the jail and then got caught and then got escaped, and that was pretty much what he did, and then he was pretty much getting fooled the whole time. So Xavier did kind of look weak in this movie, but at the end he did come out on top. It was kind of weird too at the end. We'll talk about this maybe in a bit, but when they saved him, they didn't leave him in his wheelchair. They carried him out. I don't know why they didn't leave him in his wheelchair. I think it would have been a lot easier.
Probably would be a pain in the ass to take the wheelchair with, I would assume, and to get it on the plane. That's what I'm assuming is why they didn't take the wheelchair. And also they're kind of scrambling at the end just to get everything. Did they ever establish whether Nightcrawler could take like really big solid objects with him either?
See, I thought that was a thing too that Nightcrawler could do. That's what kind of confused me about the ending is like, how come like Nightcrawler didn't like move the ship or something like that? But we'll get to that at the end because that's a little contrived at the end. But for me, I think that it's the heroes are all about Wolverine and Xavier in this movie. Everyone else is kind of the side, even though there's that focus on Jean Grey. It's just Jean Grey. They're kind of building up to the next movie with her. So I don't know. I just feel kind of something's kind of missing. But I think it's just the energy level of the performances.
I think a lot of it has to do with the problem, I think, is the movies themselves and the way that they are written and directed. I don't think that a lot of it has to do with the actors, because even when watching the X-Men, the Dark Phoenix trailer, like, Jessica Chastain has no energy, and she's speaking in the same level as just about all of the characters in this movie. So I think it is an aesthetic choice, and it is one that I don't think works, especially in 2019 when you have these bombastic superhero movies that both Marvel and DC are doing at this point. Other than a scene at the beginning between Cyclops and Jean, we really don't get a lot. They talk about the fact that Jean, what she did on Liberty Island. They talk about the fact that she is having dreams and issues with her powers, but we don't get enough Jean Grey and Cyclops. I think that for this movie to really work, and I think even for X-Men The Last Stand to work, you have to build these two characters up. And part of the issue that I think exists within this franchise is, again, the focus on Wolverine. Whereas if you have Wolverine mind controlled, for example, by Stryker, and you let Cyclops and Jean carry a lot of the action, I think the ending of this movie means so much more.
I agree, and I think that's why they took Wolverine out of this newer trilogy, to kind of focus on them more, and I get that, and that's a good thing. But yeah, it seems kind of like they had this plan to just focus on Wolverine, and I get that, but it kind of sucks because if you're going to build up the Dark Phoenix thing, you got to build up these characters well, and they kind of lacked on that. But at the same time, like, the strength of the heroes, I think, in this movie are these moments, you know what I mean? Like, even though Nightcrawler, yes, technically was a villain moment when he tried to kill the president, that moment is still, like, an iconic movie moment, you know, and it sticks out with a lot of people. And then, you know, Wolverine killing Lady Deathstrike, I like that scene a lot. You know, it's just kind of like, I'm still going to give it an 8. It's just, I feel like there's an energy lacking, and I think that's just because of Bryan Singer's directing that kind of sticks to all the X-Men movies. But I still like a lot of the moments in these movies, or in this movie in particular, for the heroes, because, you know, their actions kind of speak for themselves. And then Jean Grey kind of sacrificing herself at the end really stands out as well. So it's an 8 for me, even though I kind of criticize the energy levels.
Right. I'm also giving this an 8 because I think the stuff with Wolverine is generally well done. I love that Hugh Jackman is so much more into this role and able to understand it better. There's a lot of really great moments, despite the fact that they don't always get the best development. I think Famke Jensen and James Marsden do the best they can with the roles that they're given, and I even love the moment when Patrick Stewart is reciting Jean's lines and the way that he is able to do that. I mean, if you want to see a great acting performance in the moment, showing vulnerability, I mean, that was it. I thought that was a very powerful moment because you felt the pain of both Xavier and Wolverine and Cyclops in that moment, and I mean, a lot of the praise obviously goes to Patrick Stewart in that case, but I mean, it's just one of those little moments that I think works out so well.
Totally agree. And that's that moment where they're on the plane, and then, you know, she's talking to Xavier, and Xavier's talking to Cyclops. I thought Cyclops at that moment felt like he was going to kiss Xavier in that moment or something like that. But we kind of got that rehash in Ant-Man 2, if you know what I'm saying, where, like, Janet Van Dyne kind of took control over Paul Rudd and kind of communicated with Hank Pym and his daughter at that moment. It's kind of the same effect.
Right. And I think with the heroes, I think you get a lot more development with Iceman as well. I think the coming out scene works very well because there's clearly a distance that exists between Iceman and his family, and that is something that's the implication to me is that it is permanently severed at this point because of what his younger brother does in calling the police. And I just think that is a fair representation of what happens when discrimination exists, that people cannot overcome their own prejudices in order to accept, in a lot of cases, even the people that they love. And I think it's a message that's still important in 2019. It still was very important in 2003, but I think it's something that we still have to be very mindful of. And I'm hoping that as X-Men transitions into the MCU, I hope that they can still keep some of this going.
Yeah, I do like that scene a lot too, and it's kind of heartbreaking seeing that scene where you see the brother from the window and his reaction to everything. And there's definitely that moment where you feel like Bobby's just never gonna forgive his brother for that. Maybe in time, you know, but it sucks because like it definitely had that moment and that feel to it, and also for Pyro in that moment too, who's technically a hero in this movie, but he's such an asshole in this movie. even though he's treated as like a kid and he's tired of being treated like a kid by the end of the movie and leaves with Magneto. But I feel like in that scene, you kind of saw that dark edge, and that was on purpose of him attacking the cops. And I was blown away that none of the cops died. But apparently they just got, some burns and stuff like that. But when I first saw this movie as a kid, I thought he killed all the cops and burned them alive.
I think Pyro was kind of justified at first. I think he ultimately took it too far. But, I mean, the police were very, very aggressive. Like Wolverine, they immediately shoot him in the head, which, based on the behavior of actual police, probably is not totally inaccurate. So when Pyro first did what he did, I was like, I could kind of see that. I could kind of justify it. Definitely crossed the line, and I think Rogue was ultimately kind of justified in what she did. But I don't know. I don't think that what Pyro did was totally out of bounds there, although it got very dark.
Very, very dark indeed. But I do like that little hint of what's to come. At least they were world building in that sense, so at least they got that right.
Right, and I expect to see a lot of Pyro and X-Men in The Last Stand, right?
Yeah, because they built them up so much.
All right, let's talk about the villains. When we talk about the villains, it would be easy to first talk about Magneto because he was a part of the first one, but he's very much a supporting player in this. He is very much a part of the background, and I think that ultimately serves the movie well. I think I mentioned this on the first one, but I really am not a fan of Ian McKellen as Magneto. For me, he's always played it a little bit too old in my view, and I don't think it has ever totally worked. And that's not to say that I don't like Ian McKellen. I think Ian McKellen is very good. I think he's even pretty good in this movie. But Brian Cox, to me, is so good as Stryker. There's pathos. They develop his character just enough to make his actions at least appear to be justified, or you can see why he feels justified. I love what they are able to do with his character because he, even though he is not an actual physical threat to the X-Men, he is very much a threat because of what he can do with the mind control, the fact that he has Lady Deathstrike at his disposal, and what he just does to all the mutants. I mean, he literally mind manipulates both Magneto and Xavier in this movie, and I think that's a really big deal. He has a lot of interactions with Wolverine as well. So for me, Brian Cox is so important. If this role of William Stryker does not work, and in later X-Men movies, it definitely does not. If this doesn't work, then I don't think the movie works as well as it does. So, for me, so much of the villains does not depend on Ian McKellen, does not depend on Rebecca Romijn or even Kelly Hugh, but a lot of it is about Brian Cox. And like from the first moment he's on screen with what he's doing in the White House and just kind of his behavior, he's really, really excellent in this role, and it's a shame that he is an older gentleman because I would love to see him in the MCU as a villain at some point because I think he's just so good at it.
I agree, and he carries the villain score a lot because I feel like Lady Deathstrike, they left her so empty. Like there's a story there with Wolverine. I thought they were going to tie it all together. I remember that from the show. I was looking forward to it, and then they just cut her short, man, and I just hated that. And I was like, they should have told the story, or at least let her live and then tell the story later. And then they just never went back to it. And I love Kelly Hu because I remember her from Surf Ninjas and watching that movie as a kid. And I know that's like an obscure reference, but Surf Ninjas as a kid was like a really big movie to me as a kid. And seeing her as Lady Deathstrike, I thought was really cool. And then, they just cut her short, man. I don't really include Magneto and Mystique in the villains category because based on the title that actually, I don't know if you remember, but they changed the title like a week before the movie came out to X-Men United to tie in this whole like we're united with Magneto and the bad guys from the last movie kind of feel. And I wasn't really feeling the title, but I will include them in the heroes more so because they did more for the heroes, I think, even though they try to kill all the humans at the end. But it just felt like they were just being the heroes throughout the movie. So that's why I kind of include them. But Lady Deathstrike, it just really disappointed me. But Brian Cox was just so good. So, but then once it gets to the point where you get rid of Lady Deathstrike, and then once Brian Cox, Stryker is like made irrelevant, and you know what I mean? It's like they basically just defeated the villains really easily. It felt like in this movie. So that's what kind of like hurts the score for me a little bit. The performance is great, but once you like take down Stryker, like within the last 30 minutes, like, okay, what's there to do next because you took out the villain?
Well, I think that's why they had the twist with Magneto having Xavier try to kill all the humans instead. I think that's why they did that, so that there was at least some drama and some kind of a threat that was still happening, even though Stryker was technically defeated. So that I can kind of justify that.
I understand that, but that kind of makes it look like Stryker wasn't strong enough to be his own kind of villain. You know what I mean? I kind of wanted Stryker to be there at the end, not chained to the thing. You know what I mean? Like we all wanted to see him, get his ass kicked, but I just felt like they could have done him a little better by the end to kind of like reinforce his strength as a villain. I'm gonna go with a 7, but the performance is just so great. But I just felt like they just left everything, hanging to dry. Like, I mean, everything else was just military people and Lady Deathstrike. You know what I mean? So.
I'm giving this an 8 because of Brian Cox. A lot of it has to do with him. I like Kelly Hu in this role, even though she doesn't get a lot to do. And again, we talk about the minority characters in the X-Men being treated very poorly. Here you have a silent Asian woman who just kicks a lot of ass, and that is a trope that has been done a bajillion times before. And even though she's not an actual robot, she kind of behaves like a robot, which is also a trope that I'm not necessarily a fan of. We're going to talk about the fight scene with Wolverine that I think is really great in just a minute, but I did want to point that out about Lady Deathstrike. I think Ian McKellen is good. I think Rebecca Romijn is very good in this role. And even though Jennifer Lawrence is kind of probably the person that most people think of as Mystique at this point, I think Rebecca Romijn almost has more personality as Mystique, and a lot of this has to do because she is more of an antagonist than a protagonist, but like just her little snarky comments, her giving the finger to the soldiers as she rolls away, I think that's a really good part. So that's kind of a bonus for me, the fact that Rebecca Romijn is showing this level of personality. So that is why I'm giving this a score of 8. And now we can move on to the story. There's so many great set pieces in this movie. I think this for me is actually, this and this technical parts I think are really strong. And to me, it's, of course, starting off by having Nightcrawler invading the White House, talking about mutant freedom. I love the White House set piece. I love when they're in that museum, all the X-Men are together, and we kind of get those various conversations. We get the scene in the church with Nightcrawler, Storm, and Jean. I think that set was really well done, and I love Magneto's prison, the way that it looks, and with Cyclops and Xavier going to see Magneto, who has been mind-controlled by Stryker multiple times. Wolverine checks out the place that Xavier told him to at the end of the first movie, and he basically goes and finds that it is empty. I don't know about you, but my expectations for this was that Wolverine was going to be doing that like side mission for the whole movie, and they just kind of blew it off in like 2 minutes.
Yeah, I was expecting like that to be X-Men 2 of him finding out his origin completely, but then he just comes back and then Xavier doesn't want to help him, and Xavier could have easily just told him all this stuff, I think, but he just, for some reason, they wanted to make it harder for Wolverine to learn his origins, but easily he could have just told him all this stuff and saved the time, but that's just my thinking.
All right, and of course there is the big invasion scene where Stryker and his men try to take all of the children mutants from Xavier's school, and we get the Berserker Rage, the PG-13 version. But I know this had to be an exciting moment for you, especially because you know Wolverine, I know Wolverine, and this is kind of the moment that we were waiting for. And we weren't going to get a lot of blood, but we certainly got Wolverine in Berserker mode.
Yeah, when they're in the kitchen and he kills that dude in the kitchen, when I first saw that, and I was like, what, in 9th grade? I was pretty shocked to see that because I was like, this is PG-13, man. Like, I didn't expect to see that. Because at the time, like, the only time you saw stabbings like that were in like the hard R's and the Jason movies, and Kill Bill had not even come out at that point. Like it was months before Kill Bill was coming out. So that was pretty jarring to see at the time. You know what I mean? And then, yeah, not seeing the blood was kind of weird, but I get why they did it. But that scene is still really well done up until it's like, what, a 10-minute sequence up until they mix the ice wall at the end. But that whole sequence is really well shot because it creates this excitement and like this like, and the other thing, too, was the cameos of all the little side X-Men characters. I think we got that Kitty Pryde. That was supposed to be Kitty Pryde, I'm assuming, going through the walls. We got Colossus, who I guess is kind of in his 20s, but still is at the school. So we got all these little cameos of with the people with the powers. Probably the one that screams as well. Forget her name, but that's what I liked about that scene because it got all the cameos of all the other X-Men that we're so used to and we want to see. But it kind of was like a tease at the same time because those are the X-Men that I wanted to see. So it was kind of a mixed feelings of both, but at the end it turned out really well, and it was also a nice little like sponsorship or corporate sponsorship with Dr. Pepper, which kind of appears throughout the movie. I don't know if you noticed that as well.
I definitely noticed that there was a lot of Dr. Pepper, especially the scene when they go to Iceman's family's house, and I think that scene was also very well done from a story perspective. I did not realize, though, how much time they spent at that military compound. I mean, they almost spend an hour at that, but that's basically Act 3 is almost half the movie, and that's not something that you see in a lot of movies, period. But that is where they spend most of their time as Jean rescues Cyclops. Cyclops has Hawkeye syndrome in that he is mind controlled for a lot of this movie and gets almost nothing to do, but he is eventually rescued by Jean. We get the fight sequence between Wolverine and Lady Deathstrike, as throughout that scene and a couple minutes earlier we see the bubbling adamantium that is being kept warm, because once it is not warm then it will solidify. And I think the fight sequence is so well done. It's just unfortunate that Lady Deathstrike did not get more to do. The ending of the fight, though, is really disturbing, because we see the adamantium coming out of various orifices, and then the way that her head slams down at the bottom of the water, that is really disturbing and not appropriate for, I would say, somebody younger than 13 to see.
I was kind of thinking the same thing, because every time I see that, it's very like, wow, to make that kind of sound and impact, the head has to be really, really heavy to make that sound and that kind of impact. So yeah, it was pretty freaky, but it's a nice little touch, because it's exactly what would happen, because the animating was so heavy that it would just drop. If she was in the ocean, she would go straight to the bottom of the ocean, man. So I thought that was a nice little touch. And I liked how they tie in the adamantium as like the thing that kills her, because that's kind of the thing that ties both of them together, because they both have adamantium. And I want them to kind of like talk and like interact about that, but it just, turned into a fight sequence. But I like that little touch, how adamantium was the thing that killed her, and that's the thing that ties the two together.
Right, and the actual plot, I think, is pretty well done as well, as Stryker wants to kill all of the mutants, and he uses his son, who is... The way I understand his power is that he is able to create illusions and make people see things that they should not be seeing, and he uses his son to get Xavier to try to kill all the mutants with his mind. And I think that is a common sense way of doing it, because as this movie shows, it is very hard to kill mutants. You literally cannot kill Wolverine as he gets shot in the head by a police officer, but trying to take these mutants out is going to be very, very difficult. And to just have Xavier be able to do it, I think it's a pretty sensible idea. And of course, that is what Stryker tries to do. He fails. Magneto tries to get Xavier to kill all the humans. And we get the great scene of Storm going into Cerebro and making it so cold that the illusion is ended. And of course, all the X-Men are saved. But Nightcrawler does not go back in to save Jason, which was also kind of a weird moment, because you would think Xavier would tell him to save Jason, but he does not. And I can only assume that he is dead.
That was my thinking too. So it's just kind of weird that the way the story plays out, like it's got a lot of these great moments and great setups, but the one thing lacking in the story is definitely the character development. And, I feel like they could have done a lot more. So for me, like my score is going to be a 7. I want to give it an 8, but like I just feel like there's so many underdeveloped characters that could have been so much more. You know what I mean? You could have cut maybe some side characters out, because it does feel like there's a lot of characters in this movie already. But I just wanted more focus, and I don't know if I'm just spoiled by like MCU style storytelling where you get like great character development, but I wanted that so much, and I felt that was lacking, and that's the only thing that was kind of lacking in this movie.
I can understand where you're coming from, but I think the actual story itself is really, really solid. And that's why I'm going to give this an 8, because I just think that this movie is so consistent with its storytelling and with the set pieces and with the action. I think that is all so good that I think it compensates for some of the lack of character development. I mean, there's a lot of this movie that I was actually able to remember, which surprised me, because I have not seen this movie in quite some time, but I definitely remember a lot of things, and there are definitely some individual shots that stuck with me, and I think part of that also relates to the technical aspects, because let's face it, the suits in this movie still suck because they're leather and they're dark. There is a little bit of color in some of them. Wolverine's got a little bit of yellow, but it's not nearly enough. And That's unfortunate because I think every other aspect of this works. I think the score is much better. I think the music, it's not as good as the X-Men animated theme, but I think it comes really close, and there's a clear influence. I love the use of CGI. I think it mostly holds up. I love the pacing. I love the editing. Again, I think the fight sequences are so well done. I think for the Nightcrawler sequence alone, I almost feel like I have to give the technical score an 8.
God, I feel the same way because you watch that, and that's definitely the best looking thing in the movie. Because I mean, we talk about that third act being at the lake, an alkali lake, and there's hardly any sunlight, and it's all these dark sets, and there's like a lot of white in the background. But at the beginning of the movie, everything's well lit because it's in the White House, and you kind of got to see like a bright set. And I know it's a generic looking White House looking back because it's obviously a set, but the way they shot that, and then the CGI was just unbelievable. Because if you look at that, the first time you watch this movie and see that scene, you can't pick up on all the little things. And then you watch it at home, and if you watch it at a slower speed, you see all the little details on that fight sequence. And it's probably one of the better fight sequences put together because they take the idea of Nightcrawler and expand it with the fight sequence because he can teleport. So you can do all these little things. He can teleport up in the midair, kick a dude. He can teleport in the corner and then come down on a guy. And that's exactly what he did. So to me, that was like an automatic 8 for me. And then everything after that was kind of like a bonus. Nothing really took it down. I mean, obviously the suits will take it down because we've complained about it before. But other than that, the music was still really good and it sticks out. And I really liked the way that they shot the Bobby's house. Like that was a really nicely bright scene because obviously it was daylight, and that was probably one of the only times they could shoot for daylight in the movie. To come to think of it, so I like that sequence a lot and the way that was shot too. So I give it an 8. And the only thing left desired, obviously, is the suits and probably the lighting at the end.
Perhaps. I don't necessarily have an issue with the lighting at the end because I think you were still able to see mostly everything, and now we have to talk about the legacy. And ultimately, I think this is where the argument comes in. I think that this is generally regarded by people as the best of the X-Men team up movies. I think that this is generally regarded as one of the best superhero movies of the early aughts. And even if it doesn't totally hold up compared to what the MCU has been able to do, I think this was a blueprint for what those kinds of movies could do with characters and with set pieces and with the individual battles and trying to do these moments. I think the ending is still genuinely shocking because it was a cliffhanger, and of course it was meant to build up to the next movie. Well, this isn't something that superhero movies necessarily did. If you go back and watch the Superman and Batman movies, those had pretty definitive endings. Even the first X-Men had a pretty definitive ending, and this one definitely had that cliffhanger aspect to it. And by giving this a bigger budget, this of course made more money, and I think this proved that superhero franchises could get bigger and better if you give them the time, if you let them marinate. X2 is clearly a step up from X1. For all those reasons, I'm giving this a 9.
I'm going to give it a 9 as well because looking back at 2003, this really for an audience standpoint, it really, changed the game a little bit because it felt like, okay, we're in this new age where we're going to get all these great X-Men movies. Well, we thought we were going to get a bunch of great X-Men movies after this, but the way the audience reacted, and you know what I mean? Like, they really started to cling to, especially the Hugh Jackman Wolverine. That's when I felt like this movie kind of started that. It was really popular in X-Men 1, but X-Men 2, really solidified him as, whenever you think of Wolverine, you think of Hugh Jackman, At this point, before this movie came out, I probably would have told you it's the one from the animated series in the yellow and the blue suit. But now it's just anytime you think of Hugh Jackman, you think of Wolverine, vice versa. And I think it just kind of started here because this movie was so successful. May 2003, it kind of set the tone. There was no Spider-Man kicked ass the year before in 2002. 2003 really didn't have that big budget movie coming out at the beginning of the summer. And I remember this was the first big one. And it just kind of set the tone, you know what I mean? And everyone loves this movie, and you look back, and everyone I talk to about this movie, they have a love for this movie a lot, and they have it. And it's a mix of nostalgia mixed with the story elements too, because I mean, compare it to the movies of now, like the comic book heroes movies of now, you know what I mean? It's like a lot of them, are better than X2, right? But X2 had this standard to set, and it kind of built on that, you know what I mean? So there's a lot of building blocks that were made in this movie for other movies. So it was highly influential. It made a lot of money, and I got to go back to the advertising because the advertising was really heavy around this time, and a lot of the Dr. Pepper thing, and what was the other thing? Bobby, I don't know if you noticed this, but Bobby Iceman was eating ice cream from a Baskin Robbins tin. So little things like that. I just remember a lot of the advertising too. It was all over the place. So definitely a 9, and it sticks out. And it's a big part of like movie history, I think, to kind of influence a lot of the MCU movies today, actually.
For sure. And my total score is a 41, and yours is?
Wow, 39.
So that means that the total score of this is an 80 exactly, and that means that X-2, X-Men United, is indeed going into the superhero pantheon. And this is now the second time that my score has lifted a movie into the pantheon. This also happened with Wonder Woman as well, Brian. So it came up just short for you, but my score is good enough to push it over the top. And X-Men 2 is it's nice to have a Marvel movie that isn't an MCU movie in the superhero pantheon, and I have a feeling this will not be the only X-Men movie to make it into the pantheon.
No, not at all. And of course, we're not. I think you're automatically assuming we're talking about Logan, but First Class, man, I'm gonna have a push for that because I think First Class is a very well directed movie, and I think Matthew Vaughn should have got more X-Men movies to do. But that's kind of a preview in weeks to come. But yeah.
Oh, we are definitely, the First Class episode is going to be probably a long episode because I'm going to make the argument that it's the best X-Men team-up film that's ever been made. I think it's better than this movie still.
I would agree with that, but then, I don't know, I thought Bryan Singer kind of, despite how we feel about him in real life, but I feel like he kind of redeemed himself a little bit with Days of Future Past. But again, we'll get to that later, but First Class is definitely on that level.
I don't think there is a way for him to redeem himself at this point. I think what he needs to do is he needs to go away and never be allowed to direct a movie ever again. I think what you are trying to say is that the X-Men or this version of the X-Men was kind of vindicated.
Yes, that's what I meant. On an artistic level kind of thing. Yes, that's what I meant.
All right, let's get to the burning questions now. Are there too many characters in this movie? We are asking this 1 week after Avengers Endgame. We're going to talk about this.
For me personally, yeah, because if this was a 2.5 hour movie, I think the amount of characters would be fine because you can build more on the characters. But like I said before, they really messed up with Lady Deathstrike. I wanted more from Storm. I wanted more from Cyclops, and we did get that Jean Grey moments, but I wanted more energy from her. But again, I just feel like there's just too many to kind of focus on, and then we kind of get left out with some of them, and then you end up with a situation with Nightcrawler who doesn't even come back, and he's a great character. So
I agree. I think there are far too many characters in almost all of these X-Men movies, and I don't even necessarily I don't know who I would cut out of this, but I think there has to be a better balance, and I think it's something that they still never figured out. And once the X-Men are a part of the MCU, I'm hoping that they can find a way to balance this, where maybe you have a smaller version of the team. Maybe you only have 5 X-Men instead of trying to have 8 to 10, because I think it really does make a huge difference. Did you believe that Jean was actually dead immediately after the movie ended?
Oh, no. I know my Dark Phoenix story well, and as soon as you see that shape of the fire Phoenix in the water, it's like, okay, we know where this is going. And even in 9th grade, I was like, oh, she's coming back. I mean, come on, she's the Dark Phoenix. So, I mean, I know it was kind of a little bit of a smart mark at the time, but, I asked my teacher, and she's like, yeah, you know exactly where it's going. So I was right.
Right, and I think it definitely took people a little bit longer than it would in this modern age, but of course, Jean was always going to be coming back, and I'd be very curious to know, like, people in general, like, how they would react to this, because if you don't know who Dark Phoenix is, I mean, this is a legitimately surprising and shocking moment. Even if Jean has not been all that well developed, for an X-Men to just die like this is really surprising.
Yeah, I kind of felt that too in the audience because it was kind of like, like I do remember that moment where it was like, oh my God, is she gonna die? And there was like people on the audience, and I remember that as a kid, like some gasps and stuff. But I get that because again, no internet at the time, and you only knew about that if you watched the show. And the show, I think, has gotten bigger since this time because of YouTube and stuff like that.
Would this movie have been better if Cyclops and Jean had been the focus? Despite the fact that we already put this in the Pantheon, would this have been better?
Yes, I think so. I think the story would have been a lot better. And then I think I would have had just probably Wolverine not show up until like maybe middle of the movie. and kind of have that focus, and then all of a sudden, oh my God, he's back, and then it's kind of like the surprise because you kind of forgot about him.
I think it would have been better for the long-term health of this franchise if Cyclops and Jean had been the focus, and I think The Last Stand ultimately would have meant just a little bit more, regardless of who the director was. All right, I'm going to change the fourth question, and I'm going to ask you, what is your favorite scene in this movie besides Nightcrawler?
Probably the scene with Bobby in his house, because that's the most, the realistic drama part of the movie. To me, like that's the most realistic aspect of X-Men 2 is that scene. And you're right, it's very much like a coming out scene, but at the same time, it's like you see like Wolverine, trying to be a teacher in that moment. It's like a little acting things, you know what I mean? He's trying to like kind of hold back and cover up his powers or whatever. And then the moment he freezes the tea and the cat licks it, I thought that was like a nice little touch. And then his brother in the background, kind of just on the stairs. You know what I mean? There's a lot of little things about that scene, and it's really subtle. And I like the way it's just put together. And then, the saddest at the end of it, and then the idea that Pyro is probably going to turn, villainous towards the end. There's a lot going on with that scene that kind of builds up and, kind of builds to the other movies as well.
I definitely can understand why you're saying that. It certainly is a great scene, but there's something about Wolverine and the Berserker Rage, I think that just works, and I think it's something that everybody wanted from the first one they didn't get, but this was kind of the payoff. So I think from an action standpoint, I think it really works out. So for me, it's Wolverine finally getting to show his Berserker Rage. All right, Brian, on a scale of 1 to 10, how excited were you for a third movie after X-Men 2? We're not talking about what X-Men 3 ultimately became, but I want to know how hyped you were for X-Men 3 coming out of this one.
9, because I was like, okay, they're going to go in space, they're going to do all that kind of stuff, and Galandria and all that kind of... I thought that's where they were going, but they made it more grounded and changed the plot and made it a different type of story, and I get that. But I thought they were going to go in space and all these kind of things, but I guess my expectations were just too high. And at the time, it was definitely a 9, and I thought they were going to do more. You know what I mean? But they kind of scaled it. And not really scaled it back, but they kind of just left it on Earth, and I wanted it to be in space.
I was definitely at either a 9 or a 10 because I was curious to see what would happen. X-Men 2 was so good. They were clearly positioning for the big war in X-Men 3 and a big battle at the end. I could not have been more excited for X-Men 3 coming out of this one. Little did we know what we were in for as X-Men 3, The Last Stand, the ending of this trilogy, but not the ending of this franchise. That is what we are going to discuss next week, Brian. And I don't know if it's going to go into the pile of shame, but I think our conversation next week about this movie is going to be very, very interesting.
You'll be surprised. Like, I remember, like, a month ago, I was at, like, this video game movie store, and I don't know, we were kind of talking, me and my friend, and then the cash register guy overheard, and was like, you know what? I'm a fan of X-Men 3. I don't know why people hate it. It has these good moments. I like the action. And I was like, did we watch the same movie, dude? Or we're like, so I don't know, man. Maybe it's grown over time on people, but we'll find out because, I mean, I still have a negative kind of view on the movie, but we'll see. You never know.
I have not rewatched X-Men The Last Stand in quite some time, so I am very much looking forward to it, even if I don't enjoy the movie. There's obviously 14 years of distance now, and I think I can take a more objective look at it. But for right now, we are going to call it. And for Brian, my name is Jerome. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast this week. Again, we are returning next week to discuss X-Men The Last Stand.
Dr. Pepper, it makes the world taste better.